everyone. I want to thank you all again for coming. An excellent crowd and a wonderful way to start the new year. Hope you guys all had a great break. And the World Affairs Council, we're now back in full swing. Just beyond the young professionals, to let you know about two programs we have coming up next week. We have Gary Kasparov coming. Basically, a lot of people consider the best chess player in history. He was an international champion for about 20 years. And about 10 years ago, he moved on to something much easier. He went into Russian politics, and make it even easier, he decided to be a challenger and an opponent to Putin. So that is not an easy road to hoe, but as someone who's courageously done it, he obviously probably needs to watch what he does and says, but he still goes ahead and speaks openly and freely. So he will be here next Wednesday on the 27th. And then the day after, we will have former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, who's also the head of the CIA, for those of you who may be familiar with him as well. And for any of you who are Aggies, the former head of Texas A&M. So he'll be speaking on Thursday the 27th. So sorry, 28th, and Kasparov will be on the 27th. And before we get into tonight's program, I just in particular wanted to thank Kirksky Architecture. I think is interesting note that the speaker himself is from Mexico City, and his wife is an architect in Mexico City. So he lives he's actually not from Mexico, but has lived in Mexico for the last 15 years or so. And in particular at Kirksky, I'd like to thank Benito Guerrero and General Laird. Thank you both so much. You guys are wonderful hosts all the time. Thank you guys so much. And if there are any students out there, any undergraduate students, high school students, you can come to all of our programs for free. And then college students, just let you know, it's only $25 to be a member of the council for a year. We've had to change up some of our scheduling and dates for some of the programs for the young professionals. There were two people I was trying to bring in February. Both had to postpone. Sometimes with journalists, you can understand why they have to do that. But just to give you an idea of some of the programs we do have coming up, one will be called Syria on the Inside. It's with a journalist called Sami Mubayed. He's a journalist, analyst who spends his time between Beirut and Damascus, which is not an easy place to work either. And then I'm working with someone closely to try and bring a North Korean defector. But if you know anything about the North Korean defectors in the past, there has been a lot of issues with a lot of them with the veracity and kind of exaggerating and kind of realizing that if they make a greater or bigger, grander story, it can sell better. So trying to get someone who's perhaps most authentic. And then kind of something more related to Houston issues and kind of a lot of people who may work in the industry. In February, hopefully, we're going to have a program called The Energy Industry and Corporate Social Responsibility. And that'll be with someone called Pandora Snethkamp. She spent her entire career working all over the world in corporate social responsibility. And now to move on to our speaker tonight, someone I'm delighted to have. Someone I think I first contacted, Ioan is probably almost 2 years ago. The World Affairs Council takes a lot of time and persistence. I first contacted him when, if you ever remember hearing about the Vigilante movement growing up, I think it started in Michoacan in Mexico, about the individuals and the communities rising up to kind of take on the cartels, in particular the Knights Templars. But obviously, most of them may have been well-intentioned, but some weren't necessarily. But a very interesting movement, something he talks about in his book. And before I move on to it, we do have his book, which is selling at a discount tonight. Excellent, excellent book. It just came out literally, I think, 2 days ago, officially. And his last book, El Narco, which many of you may know, was critically acclaimed as well, so I'd recommend both of them. So now to go on to a bio. He has a very interesting bio, but I won't take too long and read too long of one. But Ioan Grillo has covered Latin America since 2001. And as you'll hear tonight, he's gained access to every level of the cartel chain of command, in particular in what he calls the new battlefields of the Americas. Moving between militia-controlled ghettos and the halls of top policymakers, Grillo provides a disturbing new understanding of a war that has spiraled out of control. Grillo has reported on Latin America for Time Magazine, Reuters, CNN, the Associated Press, PBS NewsHour, the Houston Chronicle, CBC, and the Sunday Telegraph. His critically acclaimed first book, El Narco, Inside Mexico's Criminal Insurgency, was translated into 5 languages and was finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. Grillo lives in Mexico City. Please join me in welcoming Ioan Grillo. Thank you.
So hi, thanks much to Ronan for hosting this event. It's great to be here. It's great to be here in Houston doing this, because Houston's a place where I really got a bit of a start in journalism. I went from England to Mexico in 2000 and started working there for various media, but I really started doing things for the Houston Chronicle back in 2004. It was very nice of the Houston Chronicle to allow me as a Brit to work for them from Mexico. And had these great editors. I worked with an amazing journalist in Mexico for the Houston Chronicle called Dudley Outhouse, a great guy. And the editors here were very good. They explained to me that their reader, they often called their reader Baba. I think meaning the typical Texan. Baba. So the editor would say sometimes, is that saying it correctly? Baba? Is that the correct pronunciation? Baba. So the editor would say sometimes, you write a thing, he says, Baba doesn't like that. and one time I think a journalist who was in Brazil put a word in Portuguese and he said, Baba doesn't like Portuguese. so I learned a little bit about Baba. But anyway, while I was doing that, working for the Houston Chronicle, this violence began on the border of Texas in Nuevo Laredo. And I went to cover that going back to 2004. And back in those days, they would simply say, fly up to Monterrey, rent a car, drive up around Tamaulipas. And back in those days, we could do that with less problems. Now it's much more difficult, and a lot of media don't want to cover that. And we were covering this story, this pile-up of bodies, and trying to make sense of what it was. And seeing this group, the Zetas, fighting the Sinaloa cartel. And the various Texas newspapers, the Houston Chronicle, the Dallas Morning News, and San Antonio Express, were having a bit of a newspaper battle to try and cover this story. So we were thrown in there trying to make sense of it and wondering, what this really was. And we didn't know it at the time, but this was the beginning of a new type of violence that was spread across Mexico. This violence that we saw in Nuevo Laredo in 2004, where instead of having regular guys like the old school kind of gangbangers with shaved heads and pistols and knives, you had paramilitary groups fighting. And this spread across Mexico, and I covered this and saw these years of tragedy in Mexico, but also across Latin America. But anyway, it's been a crazy year. So this is my second book. It's been a crazy year. We had the arrest of Chapo Guzman on January the 8th. On January the 9th, we had Shawn Penn's interview with Chapo Guzman coming out. And on January the 10th, we had David Bowie dying. It was like a very traumatic weekend with all this happening. So, I know people are obviously going to ask me, and among journalists, a lot of people are talking about what they think about Shawn Penn interviewing Chapo Guzman. So I thought I'd beat you to it and ask you about that to see what your opinion was of this. So I want to ask which of you, give you two options, there's no middle ground. Which of you has a generally positive view of Shawn Penn and the interview with Chapo and his story? I'm sure most of you have seen it. And which of you have a generally negative view? So first of all, who has a generally positive view of Shawn Penn and the story? Okay. It's a small crowd there. Among them, and who has a generally negative view? Okay, that's interesting. Well, for myself, I'll give some of my own opinion on this. I tried to bite my tongue a bit after this, because I appear a lot on media like CNN talking about these issues, and I didn't want to be publicly criticizing him too much on this, because the first thing is because I go out and interview drug traffickers. So I don't want to be saying that I can do it and he can't. I also think that most journalists like myself would love to interview Chapo Guzman. And I don't want to come across as being jealous that he did it and I didn't. However, he did, there are definitely some issues. He's not the most knowledgeable person about Mexico, understanding the subtleties about the conflict happening out there. And there was a certain surrealness about this. I found seeing an actor who plays gangsters interviewing a gangster who wants a movie made about him. So it was kind of a strange thing there. And you see many surreal things in this violence in Mexico. I mean, nowadays, while the violence is happening, we have soap operas, very successful soap operas, about these drug traffickers. The Lord of the Skies, the Queen of the South, Narcos, all of these soap operas at the same time. And even video games made about these conflicts. You can play video games, Call of Juarez. There's these B movies, these narco B movies, that some of the guys who are killers got narco B movies made about them while they're killing. So some of it kind of almost gets a blur. You're wondering what is actually happening. You know, you get these gangsters with these crazy names, you know, all these nicknames and this stranger than fiction things happening, and then real fiction being made about it. But at the same time, there's a real tragedy happening out there. There's a human cost. And this is not just in Mexico. There's been this violence in Mexico, but anyone can realize very quickly this violence is not simply in Mexico. There's very similar violence happening across Latin America and the Caribbean. In Jamaica, in Brazil, in Honduras, in El Salvador. So after I've been covering Mexico for a lot, I was going to these different countries trying to make sense of this by looking at the different organizations and how they operate and how they're similar. And you see many things in common. And again, this tragedy you see across the hemisphere. Between 2000 and 2010, there was more than 1 million murders in Latin America and the Caribbean. Totally incredible figure.
1 million?
More than 1 million. In Brazil itself, you're talking about every year now more than 50,000. So in Brazil itself, you're talking about half of that almost in Brazil. And incredible, obviously a figure like that can mean very little, but every individual story is very painful, and there's many stories. I'm sure many people here know some of these stories, but just one of very many, one mother I interviewed in Monterrey, who, you know, when you have this situation where you have armed groups of violent drug traffickers moving around, you have a lot of civilian deaths and abuse happening. And in Monterrey, when the setters were very powerful there, you had many horrific things happening to people in the city. And in one example was a mother who was in her home, and at 1 a.m, the door was suddenly kicked open and 10 guys come in, heavily armed guys, tie up the family. And she had 2 sons. She's a school teacher in Monterrey. She had 2 sons, one who was 15 and one who was 18. He's a philosophy student, 18-year-old philosophy student. And they started stealing some stuff. They said, "Who's the oldest of the 2 sons?" And he raised his hand. So, "I'm the oldest." Said, "Yeah, he's coming with us." And they took him away. The next day there was a call saying, "Hand in amount of money, we'll release your son." She, scrambled and got the money, complete pain, panic, unimaginable. Handed the money. No sign, didn't come back. Called the number they'd given, nothing. And she never saw him again. I mean, she's still searching now. And I met her after another massacre. She was outside. I went to cover a massacre of 49 people. She was outside the morgue, looking, trying to see if her son could be among these victims. So this human tragedy is very real. But anyway, trying to make sense. So it's very, very important to make sense of this. This is an issue that we have to try and confront. It's one of the big issues of the 21st century. So, looking at some of these photos, this was in Kingston, Jamaica, where I went looking at some of the other groups. What do you see there? What do you see in this photo? Anybody? A gun? And who's he, or what do you think he is? Teenage, okay. Oh no, okay. People often say a killer, assassin, thug, whatever. This is one of many young murderers who I interviewed across the hemisphere. What is interesting about what grabbed my attention is he calls himself a soldier. Now, I don't know if anybody here been in the military? Over there. Probably a lot of people probably would disagree seeing himself as a soldier. But he considers himself a soldier. And that is one thing that a lot of these people, when you talk to them and say, okay, what happened in your life? How did you get in this place? How are you standing there with a gun telling me about murders you've committed? They will describe, often they will seem rational people, not seem psychotic. And they will describe how they are recruited into the organization when they're 13, 14, how they begin standing on the corner with a radio, calling, how later on they commit the first murder, like an initiation, and how they continue to kill, but they see like a separation. When you ask, you feel guilty, they often, I'm obeying orders. You know, they have that separation. Now, when you look at like bunches of these guys, and this is like, not one of my photos, one of the photos that they put out. This was in Nuevo Laredo, and it was people working for El Chapo. One of the things perhaps wasn't emphasized strongly in the Shawn Penn story, the kind of squads of killers who worked for him. These guys, shortly before this was taken, put the bodies of 14 people on meat hooks. But you see this level of firepower and equipment they have, and you carry on with seeing some other equipment. These are makeshift tanks or like improvised armored vehicles, which they have. So you start to see, to try and make sense of what's going on here, this is not regular criminals. This is not cops and robbers or crime as we can understand it in the United States or in England. This is more like war. But at the same time, it doesn't make sense as a regular war. There's not a clear start date or finish date or sides. It's very, very confused. So for many years, trying to cover this and trying to make sense of this, I was like, what is this? Is it like a war? It didn't make sense until somebody told me, somebody who was an external investigator for the military, an academic, but external investigator for them, said this is a mix of crime and war. It's somewhere in between. These are the new type of conflicts of the 21st century. But like a lot of regular wars, sorry. Like a lot of regular wars, they have the same level of death and destruction. A lot of there's massacres comparable to war zones. Massacres of 72 people on one day, 193 people in mass graves in northern Mexico. And also, like some regular wars, there's things like this happening. Somebody. Things like this happening, these are child immigrants arriving in Texas from Central America. Now, this caused a lot of controversy as well. You remember this happening in 2014 when there were 67,000 unaccompanied children arriving on the southern border. And many of them had fled violence in Central America and were claiming political asylum, saying we are fear for our lives. But when you have this mix of crime, we have a difficult situation there. And less publicized than these 67,000 child migrants who arrived on the border are the tens of thousands of adults who are also arriving from Mexico, from El Salvador, from Honduras, and trying to ask for political asylum, saying, I'm a refugee. If I go home, I'll be murdered. Now, I understand that the United States is in a difficult position here. Judges are very cautious about granting asylum because they say it would open a floodgate of more applications. But there's a real case, and when you go back to where a lot of these people are from, like in Honduras, in San Pedro Sula, Honduras, which became the most murderous city on the planet after Juarez. When you go there, you see these, where there's neighborhoods that have been completely cleared out by gunmen. There's one place called La Palmira neighborhood, and you walk around there, and it's like deserted, abandoned houses. It's incredible. And that's because these gunmen from the Mara Salvatruchas, Barra 18 gangs have cleared out the neighborhood. They're fighting each other, and they decide they need a defensive buffer zone. So they want a space. If you're fighting an opposing gang, you want a space where you can fight, where you can see who's coming against you. So they clear out these neighborhoods, force people out of their houses, carry out death threats, and then you get these kind of refugees happening like this. Now, does anybody know who these guys are? Anybody, any guesses who these guys are? Anybody? The Zetas. Actually, these guys say they're the good guys. These guys call themselves autodefensas. They're vigilantes who rose up to fight against cartels in Mexico, because you had all this abuse happening. And the thing is with the cartels, they grew in power, trafficking drugs, but have now moved into a whole bunch of businesses, including extortions, kidnappings, and shakedowns, which really hurt communities. It's very predatory. So these guys rose up against them, and they said, we are the autodefensas, the self-defense squads. We will raise arms against the cartel. And this is another symptom you get when you have a failure like this kind of violence. It creates instability. This is not a simple issue of crime which carries on. This creates instability in countries and upheavals like this. Now, it was absolutely amazing traveling around Michoacan, covering this uprising of autodefensas around 2014. I mean, you drive around and your car will be stopped by a bunch of guys with guns and machetes, and they were like, these guys, and they weren't quite sure were these vigilantes or were they really a cartel or who were they? And that was the kind of surreal situation, and many of them, people in fact, running around there have been in the States for many years, just been deported from the United States or have come back to join this fight. And initially, in a way, like many, I couldn't help feel a certain emotion. This was a good thing. I'd seen the abuse of cartels over a decade in Mexico, seen the tens of thousands of dead coming from their people. So to see people stand up and say, I won't take this anymore, was inspiring in some ways. This was people standing up. These were charismatic leaders standing up and saying, we will defend ourselves against this. So incredible scenes where they go to a town and they get the whole town out and say that the cartels are killing people. Who will stand with me? Who will join me and fight with me? And people come up and volunteer and give them quite amazing scenes. But at the same time, after I covered this for a while, you started seeing more and more that in the ranks of these guys, there were many bad guys, were many drug traffickers themselves, were many people who, they said, I flipped from the drug cartel to the vigilantes. And you realize that this is very hard to see that this can be any long-term solution to these problems, to say anybody can take a gun and can take justice into their own hand. Because then people start to disappear with these guys, be tortured with these guys. Like you said yourself, they're the Zetas. I mean, who are they? Who are these people? So you have to build a real justice system. And the problem is, if we look at this whole region after the Cold War, when the Soviet Union was defeated and the United States was in a very powerful position, and the international community was looking at encouraging new democracies in these countries and encouraging good elections, or credible elections, and encouraging free markets, but it missed a third very important element, and that is to build justice systems that work. If you do not have justice systems that work, then a lot of this other stuff means nothing. Now, another big battle, this is in Jamaica again, and this is just the murals of drug traffickers on the walls. On the walls of the community, this is a ghetto in Jamaica called Tivoli Gardens. And in the Tivoli Gardens ghetto, you have on the walls murals of, says Don of Dons. This is the big boss. And again, fallen soldier, using the word soldier. So these are the community heroes on the walls. At the same time, on the walls, they have the names of people who have been killed by police officers. So the hearts and minds of many people there, they see the drug traffickers as the good guys and the police as being the bad guys. And that's the same again in Sinaloa with many people looking at Chapo Guzman and hearing the songs and the movies of Chapo Guzman. So how do you win the hearts and minds of people? It's like often when they're joining a transnational gang, they give their loyalty more to that than to their own country. I mean, people who are members of the Mara Salvatrucha 13, they don't care about the borders of El Salvador, Honduras, United States, Mexico. They'll move around. Their loyalty to their gang. It's like it's a force they relate to. And one of the issues in trying to battle for these hearts and minds are the places that many people live. This is a ghetto or a favela in Brazil, up the mountain, and very emblematic of many of the ghettos around this continent. And a lot of these places were built by immigrants from the countryside back in the 70s with hopes they would rise to something better. But now people are born there and living and dying in these kind of places. So how can you transform these realities? How can you transform that reality? Because if somebody's in a place with a dirt street, with no lights working, they can often see the cartel, the commando, the posse, the gang offers them something, and the government offers them nothing. So this battle for hearts and minds is very important. And then the issue there of burning opium poppies in Mexico, used to make heroin. And right now we have an epidemic of heroin across the United States. Again, there was heroin back in the 80s, now back in heroin. So just closing the talk before we're going to open up for some Q&A in a couple of minutes. The big issue here is the issue of drugs and drug policy. Now, a big part of this. It's said that the White House carries out a survey to try and find out how much Americans spend on drugs every year. It's a very hard number to calculate because it's a legal market. They come up with a survey, ask people, they make these figures, and they come up and say roughly Americans spend about $100 billion every year on illegal drugs. Heroin, marijuana, crystal meth, and cocaine. It's hard to know, but give or take, let's say that number is a realistic number, $100 billion. All that money going into an illegal industry. A lot of that money going to Mexico, going to Honduras, going to Colombia. It's not just the United States. In Europe, in my country, enormous cocaine consumption. In Spain, Italy. So all of the drugs moving through Jamaica, moving through Brazil, supplying these. And the United Nations thinks the global industry is about $300 billion a year. So how can we stop that money going to drug cartels? Now, before we go to Q&A, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions first. So as we're now in a big debate about drug policy reform, just to get a sense of what the mood is in Houston about this, who here believes in the legalization of marijuana? So quite a, and who here believes in legalizing cocaine? Okay, that's still numbers. So I mean, I believe there's, I think we use this term drug policy reform. I believe in drug policy reform, meaning we need to change the way we think about drugs and move about drugs. It's already changing. The debate is already changing. Marijuana legalization is happening and is growing. We do need to look at the debate about cocaine, which generates so much money. Perhaps some drugs cannot be legalized, like heroin and crystal meth, and there's still a lot of things to work out on this rocky path. But I believe this has to be confronted. And together, this issue of cartel violence in the Western Hemisphere, this is one of the big challenges of the 21st century. Right now, Washington does not have a coherent policy to deal with it. Right now, internationally, we do not have a coherent policy to deal with it. Politicians often choose to ignore it, but it's something we need to look at, and it will keep coming back. And I hope we can deal with this problem now before the violence that is so bad in many of these places also comes here to the United States, or before in 10 more years we talk about another 1 million deaths across Latin America and the Caribbean.
Thank you. And just maybe it's a few questions open up, then I'll open up to the audience. I know your book does an excellent job of presenting it. I think the level of influence in regards to corruption and basically involvement with regards to politics is incredible and dramatic. You know, obviously, you look at Red Commando in Brazil, it started out with kind of liberal tendencies, kind of in the days of the Cold Wars, kind of, you know, communist kind of backlash supposedly. In reality, that ideology probably has nothing to do with what the cartels are really doing. But is that still a force? And then somewhere in a place like Jamaica, I think what was astonishing to me to read in the book was it was just cut and dry, alternating prime ministers between, you know, Manley and Siega. Basically, between the conservative and liberal parties, they each have their own, basically, ghettos that vote in large blocks for them, and it was basically largely and publicly known. I mean, you know, is how strong a connection between these cartels, gangs, or whatever you'd like to call them, is it throughout the hemisphere, and basically, you know, where is it the strongest, and where do you maybe see the best places for improvement with regards to that?
Sure. So, I mean, yeah, well, one thing to talk about Latin America and the Caribbean, we're talking about a huge area with close to 600 million people, and big nuances here as well. Despite this violence happening, there's some very safe parts across the whole region. You go to Cancun, I'm sure many of you go to Cancun, Cancun is safer than most American cities, and it's very, very shielded from violence. Mexico City, funny enough, has about the same murder rate as Boston. But there's other places which there's extreme violence happening. And with this weird mix of crime and war, you even have in the very most hard-hit places a certain normality. You can go to Tamaulipas, you can go to Guerrero right now, and you have a certain normality happening around among, at the same time, extraordinary things. But across the continent, in terms of the worst places, right now, the most intense violence per capita in whole countries we're seeing in the northern triangle of Central America right now. So right now, El Salvador and Honduras and Guatemala, particularly El Salvador's had a terrible year. These are really ones to watch. This is really in a critical situation in terms of violence. Places like Brazil faces very, very big challenges, but also it's a very, very big and powerful country. So it still has a certain way, but there's some place in Brazil. There's many things to watch in Brazil. Sao Paulo, which is the Sao Paulo state, which is the single state that's about has 43 million people, so bigger than most countries in Latin America. And there's one single cartel, or what they call a commando there, in Sao Paulo controlling it. Very, one to watch there, very, very powerful. And Mexico continues. Mexico in a very complicated, difficult phase right now of trying to deal with the violence and trying to overcome the violence it's facing right now.
Okay. And then maybe just on a personal level, I know obviously it's probably happened more than once, but I know there's one point in your book where I can't remember which particular gang you were with. One of the guys kind of saw you and basically heard you were a journalist, and because he had an experience with someone else, a journalist, he said had been posing a DEA agent, posing as a journalist before. He said, the next time I see you, I'm going to kill you. I'm sure that's sadly something you've come across before many times. I mean, how is it you kind of, what are the protections you put in place for yourself? How do you decide when I will go and let some of these guys take me deep into a barrio, deep into a favela? How do you do that? And what's the mechanism you take to kind of watch out for yourself?
Obviously a lot of these people, sometimes they can be quite friendly, sometimes they can suddenly switch and be very aggressive, and you are dealing with people who are serial murderers.
And a lot of them are high.
Yeah. And a lot of people and a lot of guns around. So it's always a very difficult and fluid situation with these things. I will say that in Mexico, most of the violence has been, there's been a huge amount of violence, particularly against local Mexican journalists who have no protection of big media. And sadly, when local journalists in Mexico have been killed time and time and time again, there has not been a response. It's like they can get away with murdering those local journalists. It's very, very sad. There have been foreign journalists killed in Mexico as well. In 2006, there was a guy, Bradley Will, killed. There have been various threats against various foreigners. And so there's always that risk there. And there's shootouts happening and a bullet does not recognize nationality at all. But I would also say that as well as journalists, and there's also a lot of big deal made about journalists in risking, and it's a job we do and we have to do, and you can do it in Mexico, you can do it in Central America. There are risks, and again, a French journalist who was killed in Central America by Mara Salvatruchas, and various cases. But many journalists continue, and you can do this. But also, apart from journalists, many people in Mexico with less glamorous jobs are taking big risks. Truck drivers driving through these areas are facing big risks. People who work in 7-Eleven, or what they call OXXO in Mexico, often taking risks. So you could basically get held up by guys with guns. So there are many other jobs as well where people are taking equal risks, I think, with the violence as well.
But how do you make the assessment yourself when you'll go and do something?
So all the time, every time when you look at these things, you say, okay, I'm going to go. Say you have an interview set up with a drug trafficker, and you go into a ghetto area or to a town or whatever, and you have to look at it and say, is this good? When you're with these people, is it time to leave? Who do I know? What contacts do I have with them? Even going in prisons, sometimes you can interview people in prisons, but then in prisons they're not safe. I was in a prison in Honduras, and there was a perimeter with many soldiers and police. When we got in the prison, there was not a soldier or police in sight. The prisoners, they had cell phones and were chatting. They had guns. And they had dogs. They had these big pit bulls and fighting dogs. So we went in there, completely crazy. I was with a local Honduran journalist, a guy called Orlin Castro, an amazing guy, amazing journalist, who'd himself been shot by, he'd survived a shooting about a year earlier. And he's a local crime journalist, and all these guys knew him. They saw him on TV, and they were like, Orlin, they all knew this guy. So I went with him, and there was a big tension between this part of the prison and the next wing of the prison. And they were all crowding close to the door, thinking the next wing of the prison might make an attack on them. They were crowding around, getting ready. And I was saying, this is absolutely crazy. This is going to explode, this prison. I said, what's the best thing to do if it explodes, Orlin? So the best thing to do is to hide under a bed. So anyway, it didn't explode. We went to the interviews, left the prison. And it actually took 12 days. 12 days later, I got a phone call. The prison exploded, bunch of deaths. The army went in, took away guns, grenades, all of these things. They left the dogs.
Maybe let's open it up to any questions out there. Anyone? Right there, yeah.
Do you have any thoughts about the efforts to legalize marijuana in Uruguay and how it could affect the cartel in South America?
And just in case it's hard for any of you, she was asking about, a lot of you might know, Uruguay was the first, I think the first country in the world to, on a nationwide policy to legalize marijuana. And she's wondering how basically what that's impacting things in South America and how you see that.
Sure. I think Uruguay itself is one of the countries in parts of Latin America which is peaceful. Like other places like Chile, and there are places which are very peaceful and have avoided a lot of this violence and problems. And Uruguay is one of these places. The cartels are never a big presence there, and so inside it doesn't have a huge impact. A lot of the marijuana being sold probably outside some of the big most violent cartels. I think it's more important than its direct impact on the industry. It's more important as a precedent of how things can change. Now, you have had this move the last couple of years where you had Colorado and Washington State, Uruguay, and then Oregon, DC, and another state there.
Alaska.
Alaska, a big wave of states. The United States and Uruguay are contravening the United Nations. You are contravening the UN treaties, as we speak with these moves, because the UN treaties mean that any country who has signed them has to prohibit marijuana and other drugs. So a big deal is going to be, in April, there's going to be a new UN summit on drugs, and they could rewrite these treaties. We are at a historical turning point, and that could be a time of big change.
And just kind of related to that, I know when we had, former Mexican President Felipe Calderón, he said that was an issue he kind of put back to the audience. He said, you're telling us to control the cartels, control the flow of drugs, but then you have states legalizing marijuana. I mean, how, on the ground in Latin America, especially in Mexico, where you spend most of your time, how is it seen there?
I mean, there's mixed views about the actual issue itself. There's still mixed views in Mexico. Recently, the Mexican Supreme Court also passed a ruling that said that some people who'd ruled said you cannot prosecute us for having marijuana. It's our constitutional right to have marijuana. And it ruled in favor of them. So you already got this kind of weird thing happening there. But there's mixed feelings on the ground, but you do see some impact. It does seem to be that there is less marijuana coming from Mexico right now, because if you can buy, like a lot of people see that if they can buy high-grade marijuana in California, in shops there in Seattle, in Colorado, then what do they want? Lower grade Mexican marijuana or lower strength Mexican marijuana. So there's an impact happening there on the trade, but it still has a long way to go. You still have right now marijuana coming through, and you still have marijuana funding dangerous cartels like the Zetas.
Okay, no. Oleg, a question there? I'll get you next.
What's the origin of arms on all those pictures? Where those arms are coming from?
Okay, so the guns. So there are various sources, and one of them is right here in the United States. With these issues, when you have a clandestine movement, nobody knows the exact numbers. So you don't want to get into arguments about the exact percentage of guns that were sold in this country. What we do know for a fact is that in Mexico, tens of thousands of guns are constantly being traced from crime scenes in Mexico to gun sellers here. Now the guns, some of those guns are made here in the United States, some of them are made in China or Hungary or Switzerland or various countries, or Belgium or various countries, but often sold here. Now obviously it's very easy for many Mexicans, especially Mexican cartels with connections, to buy guns here in the United States and take them south. So many of these assault rifles being used to kill are being sold here in the United States. But it is not the only source. We have other places. One of them is the militaries of many of these countries are very weak, and they steal weapons from these militaries. Now, going back to Honduras, again, a critical situation. So Honduras, the country's in crisis. Suddenly we see a bunch of RPG-7s, which are rocket-propelled grenades, being stolen from the Honduran military. The next thing we know, they appear in crime scenes in Mexico. In Suriname, you get, this small country in South America, guns being taken from the military in Suriname, Paraguay, Bolivia, and turning up in favelas in Brazil. So you've got these guns and arms moving across the continent, but the US is a big contributor to that.
Maybe you have a question?
Yeah, I'm wondering what you think is the next step forward in El Salvador, given that they've tried so many different things and their situation is just so bad. And secondly, what you think about the speculation of Capital Castillo's maybe more nefarious role in Shawn Penn?
So just if any of you couldn't hear it, she was asking two questions. One about what you see the situation in El Salvador in particular. You said it's so dire right now. Where it might head to, and then also with regards to the famous Mexican actress who helped set up the interview with Shawn Penn with El Chapo. Is that what you were thinking? Yeah, maybe you could address those.
Yeah, sure. So on the first question, El Salvador right now, we'll have to look at the numbers, probably will come out now as being the most homicidal country in the world outside of the war zone. Salvador's in a critical situation. They tried in El Salvador a truce between the two big gangs there, the Barrio 18 and the Mara 13. When this truce first happened, again, I felt an optimism at first. This is a hope. In the first year after the truce, the murders fell in half. I thought, this is good. Maybe we can just sit down with these guys and say, stop killing each other. But unfortunately, the murders have gone right back up there. And in the book, when I profiled this gang and talked to some of the leaders of the Mara Salvatrucha 13, including an interesting guy called Marvin Gonzalez, he had 1,000 Maras under him. And he was a believer in the truth. He was also a murderer and an extortionist. But he had this argument that, okay, look, we're bored in this. We have to contribute to this solution. The problem is that, as they created this truce, perhaps they just reinforced the structures. And these guys said, okay, we can tell our guys to stop killing, but they've got to make some money. Let these guys do a few shakedowns. So, it gets to a difficult position now. Now, what's going to be the future now? I think a lot of instability. I think we're going to probably see a rise of autodefensas, of vigilantes in this area. I don't know, my friend Orlin Castro interviewed recently a group of autodefensas in Honduras, very heavily armed guys who are killing Maras. These people say they don't want to take, let's say, people there saying, I can't take this anymore. These gang members are committing so many murders of my loved ones. I'm going to take a gun and defend myself. I think we'll see more of that down there. More instability, more refugees, and who knows what that could lead to. Moving on to Kate de Castillo, the famous the beautiful soap opera actress who played La Reina del Sur, and who went with Shawn Penn to talk to Chapo Guzman. And we've seen various talking about her. It's funny how the news after this degenerated to like.
Just for any people who aren't familiar with you, give some background of her career and how.
Okay, so Kate de Castillo was a Mexican actress who played in what they call telenovelas, these soap operas or these series. She played the role of a fictional drug trafficker known as the Queen of the South, based on a book by a Spanish writer. And afterwards, she developed this, she came out publicly, started saying, drug traffickers, why don't you traffic with love? You could change the world. I believe more in Chapo Guzman than the president. Kind of quite strange things, and supposedly Chapo then sent her flowers. And they had these text messages being exchanged, which were then leaked.
Pretty funny.
Yeah, on some of these shows, then they suddenly getting like in, these psychologists on shows saying, why does she like violent men? Because she had like a violent husband, I think, before, or 2 violent husbands. To be honest, in terms of, we don't know the hard facts yet. We've seen some texts where they talked about doing business together. We don't know yet if they did. Talked about in these texts about, we're going to create, going to have tequila companies and so forth. We don't know yet if they did. I don't really want to, I don't have more knowledge of if she's actually committed crimes or not. I mean, by meeting Chapo, it wasn't committing a crime, in the same way that myself interviewing these guys is not committing a crime. But we'll see.
But do you think, perhaps even just for kind of to save face, the Mexican government might pursue her for some charges?
They could do. It might not be that much to gain by going after her. Okay,
I'll try to go back and forth.
They might be going to go after, but we'll see.
Okay.
Yep.
Hi. I'm from San Pedro Sula, Honduras, so
Okay.
what you're saying is a little bit disturbingly normal, so I understand a lot of what you're saying. But one of the things that we ask ourselves in our countries is, we see all this violence and war ongoing. When do you see investigations being done on the drug lords here in the United States for buying all this and kind of creating everything that's going in Latin America? Do you see that evolving at some point? Is it going to start? Because I don't see any type of investigations on anyone.
So I guess just for any of you who can't hear, she was a native of San Pedro in Honduras. Now, sadly, sometimes the murder capital of the world. And you were asking, when are these investigations going to take place for some of these cartel members or gang members at the highest levels, in the United States? And I mean, what do you see as the issues there?
This is a strong argument that's been used in Latin America for many times. What about the drug dealers on this side? What about the people here? And so for the book, actually, I opened with the story of an American who has been, for decades, moving drugs around the United States, working with Mexicans. I met him through quite a strange situation, through a British guy who was cycling in southern United States, around here, went over the border, got himself held up for a ransom payment in northern Mexico, but met, the money was paid, and he met this guy through it, and the guy was interested in telling his story. I agreed to meet the guy in El Paso, and he told his story, and he'd been in, since the 1960s, right through to very recently, moving drugs around the United States. And it was an incredible markup. He went to prison for several years, but left prison, came back, and got into moving drugs again. After I interviewed him, a few months after, he was arrested again for moving drugs over the border. And people ask the question, what about the Americans involved in this? What about clamping down on the trade here? I mean, to an extent, there is a constant law enforcement against people selling drugs in the United States. If you look in the courts, there's constant cases happening. The industry here, in my understanding, is extremely fragmented. So once the drugs do get to the border, they can break up and you have them moving in all directions. But the United States has created a certain modus operandi in this, of saying, we're going to constantly lock people up on drugs charges, but we're not seriously going to try and stop the drug industry. We're not going to send the military into neighborhoods like Calderon did and try and say, we're going to try and defeat the drug industry. Because I think there's been an acceptance that that is not possible. So, I mean, you can make big, the United States can continue to make bigger cases, and perhaps there are cases that, it should make. When you have, one time the Zetas, there were Zetas leaders here in the United States, and they were at races. There were racetracks in special boxes. They had their own horses called Cartel Number 1. So some of these think, well, how come these guys are here in the United States? There are people you should go after. But at the same time, I think it's unrealistic to say that through law enforcement, the United States will stop the drug trade here, or through law enforcement, they will stop the drug trade in Mexico or across Central America.
Chris?
Do you think that Shawn Penn's interview took El Chapo down? And if you were in the same position, would you have taken the interview?
So she was asking about Shawn Penn's interview with El Chapo. Number one, do you think the Mexican government said that was part of how they got on the trail of him? Do you think that's true? That's really what happened? And number two, would you have taken the interview yourself?
Okay, yes, I would have taken the interview if I had a chance to do the interview. Sure.
Why would you?
Well, I think there is a journalistic, I think there is a public interest in hearing and interviewing him. I hope I would have tried, with the interviews, a lot of the profiles I do in this book where I talk to killers, to heads of up to 1,000 of these people of more, the head of the Brazilian head of the Red Command. I do try and be critical in looking at them, and they themselves, say you can ask if you feel guilty and so forth about these things. You can write, I think, in a more critical way about these figures. Chapo Guzman is a particularly powerful figure, way up there in the stratosphere. However, I would have as a journalist. I think there's a public interest in hearing about him and trying to understand better. Do I think it was connected to his arrest? Yes, I do. Shawn Penn and Kate Castillo met him on October the 2nd. On October the 6th, so 4 days later, there was the first attempt to get him close by to where it happened. So there did seem to be a very clear link there. Now, Chapo escaped that, but continued to communicate with them which is kind of surprising considering how smart he was before, that his communication was almost certainly being infiltrated, and that he was allowing this to be infiltrated. That's kind of weird. It seems unlikely he would have done that 10 years ago. He survived 13 years being free. But I think I think the Mexican government said this was part of a very important part of their intelligence of catching Chapo, and I do believe them on that case.
And maybe just to follow up a bit on what he was asked about, why would you pursue the interview? And also just with regards to, obviously one of the big criticisms for Shawn Penn is he's not a professional journalist. He didn't ask tough questions. He didn't follow up on, kind of fluffy answers that might have been given to him. Are those very difficult questions to ask some of these people? And sometimes do you feel intimidated to even ask some of those questions for fear they might take it the wrong way? And then also to ask me his question of why.
When you go through interviews, you don't start with a difficult question. You don't start off talking to someone and say, "Are you a murderer?"
Yeah.
So you start off with soft questions and you build up to difficult questions.
Okay.
I think. It wasn't just simply the interview itself was weak. Probably given 10,000 words, you could describe the death and destruction. Really give some kind of sense of the human devastation of this. But I think there is a public interest. If you say, in terms of any talking to criminals, I think there's not that much of a debate of people saying nobody should ever interview or talk to criminals. I think, this, perhaps Shawn Penn, this kind of raised more criticism because it became entertainment, because he was, in a sense, the story as much as Chapo. Because you have a famous Oscar-winning actor there. So the story is Shawn Penn, rather than a regular journalist you've never heard of. So it's not the story is simply there's an interview with Chapo and here's the story and you might hope it might be well written. Now other Mexican journalists like Julio Scherer, a guy from Proceso, he met with Miles Zambada, who's the guy next to Chapo a couple of years ago, and he talked to him. To be fair, he didn't really get that much out of him either. And he's a very, very good Mexican journalist.
Have you been to Supermax in Colorado?
I haven't been inside it. I applied to go inside it to talk to a guy called Mata Ballesteros. And I met his son. I met Mata Ballesteros' son in Honduras. And I applied to try and talk to him there. But they wouldn't allow me to go inside.
Okay. And your question right there?
My family is from Tegucigalpa, but my sister currently lives in Cortez. And how do you think that it's affected as well? Cortez is good. We don't walk at night. I travel there 3 or 4 times a year, and it's dangerous, and she has the barbed wire and everything. So we never go in the streets at night. But do you think the crime, it is crime, but the drug cartel is there as well? Because I know when we go into the airport in San Pedro Sula, it's a 2-hour ride, and it's very dangerous. We get stopped by the police and pay them, and all of the things that, it's so corrupt. So my question is, do you think that the cartel is there too?
She's just for her, and you can't hear it, she's asking, basically, how pervasive do you think the cartel is throughout all of Honduras and some of these countries in general?
Sure. In Honduras, I think it's an interesting case, and a case which, again, these countries get quite overlooked in the media. A lot of people, I work with big American media, like Time Magazine, and other big American media, and even often in the big American media, they don't know that much about a lot of these countries. Mexico's already far. Once you get beyond Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, but Honduras is a very interesting case. Honduras, you look at a map and it's bang between Colombia and Mexico, right there. So you fly planes full of cocaine from Colombia to Mexico, stop off in Honduras. And you've got these massive areas of jungle in Honduras. with few inhabitants, it's very easy to fly in cocaine. There are all these runways there that can fly in cocaine. So you've got this, it's been used as a big warehouse of cocaine coming from South America. And without a doubt, there's a lot of traffickers. There are various drug traffickers in Honduras, and as well as the maras. So you have the street gangs of the Mara Salvatrucha and the Barrio 18, and you have the presence of Colombian cartels and the presence of Mexican cartels, and all kinds of things you see there where the Zetas will go down there to buy guns, with the Knights Templar from Michoacan will go down there to buy drugs. So it's become a country that's been in the center of all this, and the effects have been devastating for the country. I mean, it's been really hammered by the drugs and violence. And without, I think, there's no doubt that serious drug cartels. I mean, I interviewed the who was like a drug czar in Honduras in 2009, and he was an interesting guy. I interviewed him on a Thursday. I left, and on the following Monday, he was murdered, picking up his daughter from school. It's still a very, very hard situation there.
Yeah, question there in the back. It's there. And Alan, I'll get you after that. Okay. Yeah. Okay. You got it. Yeah. Sure.
So I was wondering if you could talk about the sort of lack of wherewithal of Mexico's security institutions to deal with the violence. Because if you think about Mexico, it's 2016. It's an OECD country. They have a well-trained Marine Corps. They have well-trained special forces. They can't keep the most wanted man in prison. And why is it they can't deal with very overt violence on a very large scale? And furthermore, why do Mexican citizens put up with that? If this were going on in Arizona or Utah or Texas or somewhere, American voters wouldn't put up with it at all.
I guess he was just asking, in Mexico in particular, the security apparatus, everything from the beyond, I guess, local and state police, but the federales and the Marines and the military, is it more an issue if they're not capable, even though they're very well trained, someone can do it, or obviously is it issues of corruption or lack of political will, and why do the Mexican people themselves not kind of demand more?
So with the Mexican security apparatus, and this again comes to the problem when you have this mix of crime and war, like who is dealing with these people and who should be dealing with these criminals. When you have these heavily armed groups with the kind of guns you saw, makeshift tanks. So when you look at the Mexican security apparatus, you've got it on various levels. And so the bottom level are the local police forces, the city police forces. And they're badly paid, badly armed, badly trained, and corrupt, in many cases. So tragically, these are overwhelmed by cartels. Now there's an attempt in Mexico now to say, one example of one of the worst examples of local police being very involved with cartels was the attack and abduction of 43 student teachers and killing of 3 more teachers and 3 passers-by in Iguala, Guerrero in Mexico in 2014. Now there's an attempt in Mexico to say these local police forces are no longer sustainable. They can no longer stand up to the security situation and need to consolidate and have single state police forces. Now I believe that is a good idea, but it still has a long way to go because many state police forces are also very corrupt. So you have to first create these state police forces and then really renew them and have a constant check and balance internal affairs departments to try and look at them. Now there is one force in Nuevo León state that's been created called La Fuerza Civil, and that is a marked improvement. There are ways you can recreate this. When you go up the scale, as you mentioned, to the Army, the Marines, well, the Marines are a very well-trained, elite part of this. But it's still problematic of having highly trained Marines running around dealing with this situation. Because in the military, and well-trained military are trained to kill. and you're dealing in a situation with many regular people around. So you have to try and create law enforcement institutions that can meet this challenge. Why do Mexican people put up with this? There's been times when Mexican people haven't been putting up with it, and they have, there was a movement, there's been various movements in Mexico of people being on the streets again and again. In 2004, there was marches against crime. In 2008, there was marches against crime. In 2011, a poet called Javier Cecilia had his son killed in Morelos State. His son was murdered. And he came out and devastated by this. And they started this movement saying, hasta la madre, which, I don't know who wants to translate hasta la madre. We've had enough, we're sick of it. And but we're a bit harder than that. And they were coming out, going to town squares, people were coming out, telling their stories of their family members have been killed. So there was movement again. After Iguala in 2014, again Mexican people went out on the streets. So there is a will there, and also these vigilantes coming out. There is these rumblings there. But the problem is to direct this anger into real social change is the challenge.
And Alan, you have a question?
Yes. One of the things I'm most interested in is the movement of money. When you talk about $100 billion, I can see it in two ways, and I'd like you to comment. One is the sophistication in moving that kind of money, especially at large sums. You have to have some kind of complicity within the banking system. You have to have some kind of complicity somewhere along the line in use of the social network, etc. The second factor is that because that drug money is so well dispersed in the community, it's in such small amounts and goes into every family, every community, that it would be almost impossible to trace, impossible to shut down. Is it a combination of both, or is there any kind of, in these countries, effort to go after the money at a very sophisticated, a large effort, or a large amount type of program?
I guess just for if you can't hear, you just basically when you get into the question of money, obviously you're dealing with billions of dollars that have to get from places like the United States or Europe, back to Mexico and whatnot. How is that done? How is the money collected and transferred? Are some of the banks complicit? How much of that is transferred in straight up cash? And then once it gets in the communities themselves, how is it dispersed? And is there any way to kind of track that and effectively shut that down?
So yeah, it's very interesting trying to follow the money, and it goes in many directions. You've seen money in banks all over the world. I talked to the lawyer who was the lawyer for Pablo Escobar and various other drug traffickers in Colombia. And he said many of his clients move their money to China now. But also within Mexico, you can see buying houses, buying property. I went to a whole week-long conference on money laundering or on anti-money laundering. And they showed that one way was to buy prepaid cards. You have loads of money, you buy prepaid cards. People were buying houses with prepaid cards. There was a guy called Shen Li Yegun, who was a Chinese businessman who's actually here in the United States now, who imported precursors for crystal meth into Mexico and sold it to cartels. And he had in his house $207 million cash in his house, Mexico City. He would come up to Las Vegas with enormous suitcases of cash. He wasn't very good at money laundering, it seemed, because otherwise he wouldn't have had all this cash sitting around. But he would go up to Las Vegas, gamble, crazy amounts of money, and get paid back checks and cars and kind of things. So through Las Vegas and our place. But anyway, in terms of the real attempt, there's been, people talking about this for a long time. There's some attempts now. If you go to Mexico, it's not as easy to sell dollars as before. They want to know who you are. You can't walk in, whereas before you could walk in with a big bag of dollars and sell them. In fact, in Mexico, if you want to buy cheap dollars, the place to go is Sinaloa. On the street, they're selling dollars very cheaply. It's like, when people, they move that because it's harder now to go to a bank with a lot of, they're trying to crack down. They can do more to try and stop the money. I personally, though, believe they should do more, and it could reduce a bit more and give a few more inches in the battle against these organizations. But it will not be a magic bullet which will defeat them. Because as a money laundering specialist, or an anti-money laundering specialist told me, money is like water and it finds the path of least resistance. They'll find a way to move the money, but make it more difficult.
Okay.
One thing to add,
Okay.
New York City and several other cities have recently passed laws in the real estate community about large cash transactions in buying property. And the real estate agents are all up in alarms because a lot of these $5 million homes, $10 million programs have basically been cash transactions. And it's going to be a very interesting battle in the courts here.
Okay.
I'll look out for that. I could watch in that case.
And I know we have a lot of questions. Just for sake of time, may take like one or two more. And I know Ioan is going to be signing books in the back. So if you want to get a book and ask him a quick question there too, I know he'll be kindly to answer there. But I know you've been waiting for a while too, and then I'll get you guys. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
You'd started off the conversation by saying that the lack of a criminal justice system has sort of led to some of these problems. So my question would be, along those lines, what do you think the U.S. policy ought to look like in addressing this issue, but also not just the U.S. policy, but also in countries locally like El Salvador and Jamaica?
Sure. So I think the U.S. government is a many-headed beast. You've got all different agencies, people with different agendas. What the CIA wants is different from But with this issue of organized crime, global organized crime, and especially in this hemisphere, weak governments, organized crime, there needs to be a move towards a coherent policy on this. So there needs to be inter-agency discussion about this and saying this is an issue we have to look at in the long term. Now, in terms of a policy of, okay, when you say, okay, we have money, there's this discussion right now in Washington saying we want to back up Mexico, Honduras to fight cartels. You've got to be very careful about what you're doing. Now, I wrote a story a couple of days ago about the shakedowns of mayors that cartels are doing in Mexico now. What cartels are doing is going to mayors and saying, you have to give us 10% of your budget. We're no longer happy to bribe you, you've got to pay us. Now, these mayors are given money by the Mexican federal government, which is supported by the United States. So if you're giving money, which is going and ending up in the hands of cartels, you'll be very careful about that. So you have to think about the efforts are in building the institutions. Now the path to building a justice system in Mexico or in Jamaica or in Brazil and Honduras is very tough, but it's not impossible. If countries around this planet can build justice systems and others can as well, we're not that different. So there has to be a way that these institutions can be built, and it has to be seen as the long-term goal there.
I'm going to take the bigger question first. As far as when you said the United States government, and not to put words in your mouth, we're not neglecting, but we have to confront this issue. The fact that maybe we're not confronting it in the manner of which many people might think we need to, do you believe that's because of either it's not a big enough problem yet, or because of a type of off-the-record foreign policy that we don't really want to piss off certain countries' governments for the number one leading outsource and then go to war because we can end it like that, but we don't want to get them too upset? On a smaller scale here, my sister was in the military in San Ysidro and did a 6-month operation for a tunnel underneath Mexico for marijuana coming in. She became a deputy in Fort Collins, Colorado, and she said that there has been reports about now there's a spike ever since marijuana got legalized. There's spikes in the drugs, trafficking of heroin and things. Can you comment on how that might affect, or would it make an impact on things like K2, Kush, synthetic marijuana that seems to be spiking up?
And yes, educator, it was one, I guess, asking a broader question. Why do you think it is that American foreign policy hasn't, taken on a hard and severe stance in regards to action, maybe like what happened with Plan Colombia, stuff like that? Is it because of political will, or they don't want to upset the wrong people, or it's not a big enough issue yet for the country? And the second was with regards to, you're saying, with the spike in the use of synthetic marijuana and stuff like that. You're going to address that? Okay.
Okay, well, look, with the issue of why the United States does not confront this or ignores this in many cases, the thing is mixed reasons about this. One is that politicians do not see how they're going to gain politically from this, getting involved in this. I remember the debate, presidential debate in 2012. And that year, American agents were attacked in Mexico. CIA agents were attacked in Mexico. Many American citizens killed in Mexico. Yet, in the foreign, and that the whole issue of the drugs and the guns and all these things, it was still Mexico was on top, very highest level of violence. And it was not discussed. Pakistan is an issue. It was like the other issues that are beyond. I think when the politicians, they see a clear stance they can take against radical Islam, which is, taking a strong position, obviously, which they should do. But to try and deal with the complicated issue of cartels and this on their doorstep, on our doorstep here, is more difficult. They often just choose to ignore it. It crosses very strange lines in politics. It gets caught up in the immigration debate. It gets caught up, the drug legalization issue. You have some like free market capitalists who are very much in favor of legalizing drugs, but also, social conservatives who are against it. It crosses funny lines. You have the human rights abuses issue. So it crosses politics in strange ways. But really, I don't see this problem as being an ideological issue. This is something which most of us can agree, whatever our ideologies are, we can agree we do not want to live in a world with this level of violence and with these kind of frightening forces. But it's a good point. The violence has been largely outside the US borders. You've said, if this was happening in Arizona, if some of what's happening in Honduras or Juarez was happening in the United States, or in England, I cover these things in Mexico, and I'm covering 49 decapitated bodies. If there was 5 of these in England, this would be such a reaction. So it's still outside the borders. The other question, if cartels legalize marijuana, will they turn to traffic more heroin because they lose money legalizing marijuana, so they do heroin? Trying to understand the drug trade is difficult, and it's sometimes dangerous to make conclusions based on limited evidence like with this. You have a complicated relationship between the supply and demand. If people are buying more heroin, they're looking for more heroin, so they also rise to that demand. That's complicated as well, of the reasons why people are taking more heroin in this country right now. And you talk to people, some people are looking at the issue of overprescription of painkillers with opiates and a culture of taking drugs, legal medicinal drugs in that way, and then gaining addiction to opiates, leading to heroin as well. So there is a mixed relationship there. However, I don't, it is possible, to try and find specific cases of farmers who say, I'm not making any money with marijuana anymore, I'm going to switch to opium. It's possible. So it's a big challenge. It's a big challenge going forward.
And again, which I'm afraid, just for the sake of time, I won't be able to take any more questions. But maybe last thing to end.
One last question?
Yeah, and maybe I know just for time, I'll get go with basically, an easy question to finish with. I know something you address at the end of your book. You kind of break into 3 sections. But what would you see as kind of strategies that some of these governments could pursue to kind of curtail the cartel and gang problems, and or how much influence, direct influence, you think the U.S. could have, say, with regards to what is considered generally a success story in Colombia, with Plan Colombia, and kind of almost seems like the levels of violence and the issues in Mexico and Colombia have kind of switched. What Colombia was in the 90s is kind of what Mexico is now. So.
Okay, so the issue about solutions, and it's tough. It's an ongoing conversation we need to have. But I look at the 3 areas of solution. So one is building justice systems, and there are examples of improvement. There are positive examples, like the Nuevo León, they've got a better police force. In Nicaragua, a country in Central America, they've got a more effective police force in a poor country, for various reasons. The many parts of Central America and Latin America. In Colombia, there are some successes by the Colombian National Police. So we can look at examples where there have been more effective police forces in this country, more effective courts, and when they have reduced the power of crime, the level of organized crime. Another issue is this hearts and minds, which was the term that Americans used in Vietnam, American military used in Vietnam. They lost the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese. And in this case, I think it is a comparison that holds true. You lose the hearts and minds of people in many of these places, that they prefer the cartel or the gang. In these cities, I find all the time amazing social workers out there who are doing amazing work. In Ciudad Juarez, a woman who was from these neighborhoods, this girl Sandra, who would go and reach young people drifting into the cartels and be able to reach them and work with them and try and steer them away. In Jamaica, I found out the former coach of the national soccer team was running a soccer team in a ghetto and pulling out, saying he's fighting to compete for the hearts of these children. I know that the dons and the criminals are there looking for them as well, but for that moment when they're playing soccer, they're not being shot, they're not being murdered, they're not at risk. So across the continent, there's many smart, talented, dedicated people, but often with no resources. And sadly, some of the programs, the big money programs, are not going down there to these people where they really need to go. But there has been help sometimes through USAID and so forth to these, and there is money well spent. But also, how do you transform these places? How do you, often with limited money, transform a ghetto area? How can you change it so that, and you have to really make this an institutional approach to how you can transform these areas. Now, there was a mayor of Medellin who had an interesting idea. He said, he was a mathematician, and he said, it's a mathematical problem. You have to change, I have to put the best buildings in the worst neighborhoods. So he built a music conservatory and built it in the worst ghetto in the city. So people would have to go down there and start creating, he built cable cars up, and there was a reduction in violence with these things as well. So there are thinkers there seeking solutions to this. And then the last issue is the idea of drug policy reform. Like I said, it's not as simple as, I don't want to pretend that drug policy reform is simple. And again, it's not a simple click, it's all going to change. There are horrific drugs like heroin and crystal meth with very horrific consequences in communities. But it is now a chance, we're living a historic moment, and this is a chance now to reassess this debate. Drug prohibition has been going for about 100 years. It began after 1914, the Harrison's Narcotics Tax Act in the United States. After Richard Nixon, upped the ante with the war on drugs, began for more than 40 years, and it hasn't succeeded. There is a chance now to reassess this, to say how can we legalize some drugs or look at other ways and really approach rehabilitation for many victims. Now, many people who are heroin addicts have personal problems as well. It's not simply the drug is there and you choose to take it suddenly irrationally. People who have often other issues will fall into this. So you have to address those issues as well to try and reach the core of this problem.
Okay. And again, I'm sorry I can't get to all of your questions for the sake of time. I feel bad. But again, I just want to thank so much our host tonight, Kirksky Architecture, and in particular, Jenna Benito. I'm not sure if you guys are still in the back somewhere, but thank you guys so much for hosting us. And we are selling his excellent book in the back. I just finished it last night. I highly recommend it, and El Narco as well. And most importantly, I want to thank you, Ioan, for an excellent time for coming, and we'll hope to see you again. And thank you all for coming.